All right, welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. So today we're going to talk some world building stuff, but more in particular actually about characters. So we want, of course, to create believable characters that make sense in our settings. And for that, I have David here to help me out today. So welcome, David.
Hey.
Maybe you want to say a few words about yourself?
I go by the published name DB Halber. I'm self-published, and I'm a storyteller since young childhood. So I've got practice.
Cool.
I'm young, but I have practice.
That's good. That's good. So when we are talking about creating believable characters, where do we start, David?
Really, you have to just jump into the deep end, because with characters, there's no stairway up to building a believable character. It's just how you see the world. So from what I understand is with how I go about things, I find there is two really distinct methods that characters come into being. And they go with the different personality traits that people may have, extrovertive or introvertive.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, authors tend to mix the two together. They'll favor one or the other depending on how they work, but they'll mix the two. With extrovertive, you have the cliche of don't make the author angry because they'll put you in their book and make you the victim. And with introverted, you have characters that are coming from the deepest recesses of the author's mind and really tell you who the author is more than what they're looking to write about. In some cases. And in that notion, you can understand that when you're looking to build characters and you're looking to make characters that are relatable, believable, and distinctive of each other, you can actually see the definitions between those two methods as you go about each option. So if you're looking to make a character believable and you're an extroverted person, the easiest way of going about it is to talk with your friends. See how your friends, how people out on the street interact with each other. Use the emotions that the different conversations you hear and you are a part of, how the words flow together, and how
You lost your train of thought.
Yeah, presque-vous there. How the words flow together and how expressions on the people you're conversing with are portrayed while they're saying those things, because emotion is most well expressed through the expression, not the tone. You'll find, and that's one of the biggest things I find that is most important about character building in general, is to make distinctive characters, you have to have good description of the character. If your characters, after your character is introduced, from that point on, saying the character's name should be a trigger for the reader's mind in popping up a picture of that character for them to know who that character is. Right. So if you can't establish that early on, you're going to have a hard time. So knowing physical and notes to write down are things like physicality, the personality, and also the voice. Now, I said the tone of voice in conversation isn't that strong because you want to add into the conversation like with raised brow, because that tells someone more easily that someone is curious about something than with a curious tone. It separates the understanding of the character.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the way that people talk also, as you say, it tells something about them. And there's also the type of words they would choose. So, for example, if somebody was from a sailing background or merchant background or whatever,
Right.
or his father was a town guard, they would also choose different kind of words to describe things.
Exactly. And you have to be unafraid of writing an accent into your character's speech, your character's dialogue. I have a character that I write who uses a very heavy Scottish accent. And while it is difficult to read at first, as you learn the character, it becomes easier to recognize what he's saying. Just like in the real world, you have people who, if you meet a person with a heavy Scottish or a heavy Cockney accent, it's going to be difficult to understand them at first entirely. But if you hang around them, you start to understand what they mean with what words.
Yeah.
And all of this is most easily definable in an extrovertive sense, because you can actively go out into the world and write down descriptions of people you see. But the strongest parts for an introverted person to have is making characters relatable. Because making characters relatable, you have to define what the character likes and what the character dislikes, and you also have to know what the character wants and not express it innately. But when you are building a character, having them always looking to strive for what that character wants, what their goals are in every conversation, because that's how humans work. Every action we take is either striving towards something we want or something we want for someone else. And then on top of that, to make them relatable, have something that's attached to those wants that the character actually needs instead. So the character wants to be beautiful, but they need to realize what beauty is. It's not the physicality, it's what's on the inside that counts, type of thing, if I were to use a cliche.
Yeah.
And going back to...
I just wanted to jump in, because there is another aspect, I think, to when we're talking about making a character relatable, and that is the fact that the character needs to be something that we can relate to. Meaning that if the character is like Superman,
right, I was actually
completely unrelatable, because it's like, well, we can't recognize ourselves in that character whatsoever. But I think that's also why the trope of the farm boy who grows up like a Wheel of Time, the farm boy who grows up to become Superman, basically, or Frodo, for example, all those characters. That's why they are so relatable, because we understand the kind of everyday man.
And that's actually, I was about to jump onto that. I was talking earlier about making characters believable. And I think it fits more into making a character believable, that you then make them more relatable. Because if you can believe that the character is real, then you can relate to them more. Right. So in knowing that, you have to recognize and be willing to portray a character's weaknesses more often than their strengths, because it's through our weaknesses that we show the most character in real life. Our strengths are something that we do with ease and we do without thinking. Our weaknesses are where we struggle and where we grow. And then we have to make sure that our strengths are not overtuned. I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and video games, and by overtuned, I mean overpowered or Superman. Right. Something with unbelievable amounts of power without necessarily having worked for it or earned it. That type of thing.
Yeah.
And putting all three of these aspects together really makes the character distinct. Because once you can make each individual character believable in their own, make them each relatable in their own, and then you take into account all of their physicality and how they portray themselves and the accent they use and their personality, like if they have a general bounce in just how they treat others, or if they're hunched over, growling, angry old man, that's where you find characters are most distinctive. But then you get to how to most actively utilize these distinctive characters, these believable and relatable characters. And they're, in my personal experience, I find the way I do this is I restrict what I say in the book to only what the characters know. So, like I was saying, with having needs related to what a character wants, a character might say what they want, but they'll never know what they need until after they've gotten it. And even then, they might not recognize that that's what they needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and so in restricting a reader to the character's knowledge, you have good and bad aspects. Good, you get deeper connection with the characters and their plight. You can if you have this, and this goes to the bad as well. If with restricting readers to the characters' aspects, you can see them struggling through the challenges that they're placed through. The puzzles don't, the reader doesn't have the answer already as well. On the other side of that, if the characters reach the answer before the reader did in their mind, it might feel like the reader was cheated, like the characters got this Deus Ex Machina a boost to get them through whatever challenge they had, and that might make them a little less believable or relatable. But maybe it's just one of those things where the reader just didn't get it. And if that's a case that comes up, it's more of, well, why didn't that reader get it? What extra detail could you add to the other parts of your world, like leading up to the challenge, to the foreshadowing, that you thought that you had expressed and had given the characters that knowledge of, but in restricting how much knowledge you give to the reader to only what you give to the characters, what did you leave out in that meantime of characters are sleeping or time is passing and your characters are doing the day-to-day stuff and you fade past that type of stuff?
Yeah, and I would think in that case, if the character figure it out before the reader, I think in that case mostly readers would be annoyed with the author, not the character, because then it's more it becomes more like a almost plotting issue, so to speak, in that we haven't laid out the seeds correctly so that the reader could arrive at the conclusion. Unless, of course, it's kind of a mystery plot thing where it's supposed to be that you can't figure it out, but I don't necessarily think that it let's say gives us a negative impression of the character for figuring something out that we didn't figure out.
Right, and hopefully by then the reader has fallen in love with the characters enough, believes the character enough, and relates with the character enough that they don't blame the character, and they blame the Deus Ex Machina on the Deus Ex.
Blame the author.
Yeah. But that's also a good thing, is that you don't get if you restrict to character knowledge, you don't get misleading foreshadowing either. Like in the situation where you do this, you write this grand scene of two people interacting, and it doesn't have anything to do with the main plot, and your characters aren't there, and you're trying to establish the tone of a city. You can't accidentally foreshadow something in that type of scene if you restrict to only what your characters know, because the characters aren't seeing that scene anyways.
Yeah.
But that also comes back around in a bad way, because you can't do the villain establishment type of scenes either. And you can mix and match these things. Like, you can choose to restrict only to character knowledge, except for the villain establishment scene type of where Voldemort helps someone escape from Azkaban. didn't actually happen in the books or in the movies. I understand. Using it as an example, you can't have those cutaways from the characters if you restrict only to character knowledge. But I mean, like with everything, it's up to writer interpretation. You can do whatever you want. You can make a 17-foot tall puppy person who, I mean, this is going to make them very distinct as a character, and people will recognize who they are, but they might not be believable. They might be relatable, because being relatable is more about personality, more about, I recognize this character's strife. I recognize what they're trying to do. I mean, believability is where you're really suffering there. And I think that's why it's good to break down characters into these three aspects, and you can choose which ones you want to break and which ones you want to bend, because that's the art of being an author, is choosing what rules to follow and which rules to bend for the situation.
Yeah.
You can make a very believable character who's not relatable in the slightest. I mean, if you make a character who's very comes from a very strong background of wealth, his personality shouldn't be relatable to most people, because most people don't come from wealth. They don't have that insight into how that upbringing would make someone out to be. But they might be a believable character, and they might be very distinctive in the person's mind, have a scar over their eye from lacrosse accident or something. But
yeah.
But then you have the giant puppy person who is who might be very relatable, might come from the standard background of lower middle class type of situation, wherever your hierarchy is within your fantasy. And then, but he's not believable because he's a giant puppy person. But that also helps make him more distinct. And you choose, as you build these characters, what rules to bend, which rules to break. It's kind of like the 3 pillars of fantasy with people, places, and things. You choose which one you want to be the main focus of that character. As with the 3 pillars of fantasy, you choose which one you want to be the focus of the story, and then the others kind of just help boost that, help be the background, make sure that that thing can exist in the continuum of your reality, as it is for fantasy writing.
Yeah, true. And the number one thing that makes or breaks a story is the character. I mean, you can have amazing plot, you can have amazing world building, but if all your characters really suck, then the thing is not going to work. But on the contrary, if you have the most amazing, believable, immersing characters that you can possibly imagine, and the world building and the plot might not be like the best it could be, the story will still work.
Right. So in your opinion, that characters are the most important pillar of the 3 pillars of fantasy. I would tend to agree. But I know there are stories out there where, I mean, Lord of the Rings, characters are strong, but they're not the most important thing. They're not the strongest part of the story. The strongest part of the story is wrapped around the ring, the one ring to rule them all, and the characters are more used to facilitate the story of the ring.
Well, yeah, okay.
And they have to be strong, because they can't. You have to have all 3 pillars. You can't write a story without one of the pillars. If you don't have a place, the characters exist in a void. And then there's nothing to have a story of, because H.G. Wells, I think I said that name right. Void creatures in the void exist in timelessness and nothingness, and there's no story there to be had. So you have to have the place. You have to have thing, because a character without things, well, you're dealing with sexual harassment suits then.
But I mean, of course, you need to have the other things as well, and the more that you can master all of it, the better, of course. But and it, I guess, depends on how you look at it, and it's not to get into semantics, but I would still say Lord of the Rings, Frodo and Sam is what carries the story. Without those guys, I don't give a crap about the ring, to be honest.
Well, yeah,
but
that's entirely true. But you could easily replace those two characters and still have the same story. You could replace those two characters and have the same story. That's my point.
Sure,
but
certainly. Yeah.
We're really talking about character design with this, and I was just using those three pillars as a way of talking about the believability, the relatability, and the distinctive nature of building a character, and how you can make a character that's very distinct, and it's a good character because they're very distinct, even though they're not quite as relatable or believable. Because as soon as the reader reads the name of that character, they have the image of the character in their mind. And you can have characters that are very believable but not very distinct, and have authors who hold back on details of the character when describing them and let the reader fill those in, and still have a very good character because they're very believable and relatable. And then you can have a character that's very relatable. And that's kind of where I was going with the three pillars point is you need, especially when you're starting building characters, you really want to focus on one of the three and really get good at defining that. And then you can practice with the others as well. And you work on defining each of these until you can intermingle them with different characters throughout your story. Because what's really good is when you have a very distinct character with a character who's not so distinct, so there's a little bit of ambiguity about how the interaction is being affected based on the vagueness of that character.
Yeah, that's true. And also, this goes hand in hand with world building in general as well, in the sense that for you to be able to show a world that we believe in, the same thing applies for characters. If we are to show a character that people can believe in, we need to understand the character. We need, as an author ourselves, we need to understand why are they the way they are. You need to, not that you have to put any of that in the story, but you also need to understand where they're coming from. How was their upbringing, what happened in childhood that might have molded a bit who they are now. And you don't necessarily have to put any of it on the page, but it will still bleed through, in the sense that if you understand it, you can show some of it, and it becomes a more rounded character instead of those flat characters that was also kind of saying.
And for people who have issues with trying to lock down these different aspects, I can't recommend enough the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. Their latest edition of Dungeons and Dragons, 5th edition character. In the character building process, you define your abilities, which is your believability. If a character is too strong, then you lose the believability. You define your background, your personality traits, your ideals, your bonds, your flaws. And then if you add on top of that, giving a character 3 very important wants, things that they want to have achieved or obtained before they die, those bucket list type of things, and then connect 3 needs to each of those wants, you start really getting fleshed out characters. And my current only self-published book is actually the second book I've written, because with the first one, I was really learning how to build these characters, how to build these worlds, and put them all into a story length feature. And I actually have, for each of the characters that I use in as a focal point, I have a character sheet that I have those personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws. Because if you are in an interaction and you are not sure, and actually that's one thing as well, is you can just have a notebook that you write down these things in. You don't need a Dungeons and Dragons character sheet or anything like that. You can simply have, this is my character's most distinctive personality trait. They're very bouncy type of thing. very giddy, naturally happy type of thing, or they're naturally upset, or they tend to be drunk type of thing, or they're what have you. And you can have these written down, and that way, anytime you have that character in a situation, you can easily just pull out that notebook if you're having trouble really connecting with that character at any time. And that's where writer's block comes in often, when it's character between character interaction, is you don't know how the characters would interact with each other. So sometimes it's just a matter of pulling out the character and reminding yourself, this is this character. True. They might have changed from when you wrote it down, and in that case, you might want to make changes. But you need, it's good to have a solid object that you can look to and be like, this is my character.
Yeah.
If you have trouble with it normally, or if you're newer to that process. And train of thought is not with me today.
Yeah,
I have not had my adequate amount of coffee.
No, exactly. But you triggered a thought though on my end, and that was when you're talking about the traits and all of that. I think it's also important to be mindful. I mean, maybe not if you're doing the role-playing stuff, maybe that doesn't matter. I don't know, but at least writing books, you also have to be mindful that it helps a lot if the audience can root for the character. So if you do pick traits for the character where he's just always really angry, always really drunk, or upset, or annoyed with other people, you might be able to justify in his background why he is so. And to some degree, I would bet the audience would go along with it. But at some point, if you don't start changing it to something more likable that we can start rooting for him, there's a fair chance that the audience will just get tired of this character pretty quickly. Don't you think?
Well, it's not a bad thing to have for a side character that you might have die at some point within the story. So, and that might be what the audience ends up rooting for, like, finally he's gone type of thing.
Yes.
But it's just.
But and that's true. If it's like a side character, then certainly that could work. But if it's like your main protagonist, I'm just saying you need to be careful. You need to really think it through before you start doing something like that.
My thought process has always been, if you're going to make a character, make it someone who's good.
Yeah.
Not in good character building aspects. Make it someone who, when the choice is given to them, they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the betterment of others, because that's what, as humans, I think we aspire to do. We would like to think that in a given situation, when someone else is in need, we'd like to think that we'd jump in and we'd help. And that's what makes the best protagonist, because it makes sense for someone who is going to sacrifice life and limb for not even their own benefit, but for someone else's that they don't even know. That makes good stories. That pushes into the epic quest type of dynamic.
Yes, exactly.
So that's yeah.
Very good. We're also coming up on time here, David. So is there anything important that we need to add before we close?
Not really. I hit every point I wrote down, and so unless there's something I missed that you thought I missed, I think that pretty much covers all I know about character building.
Cool. Very cool. So, David, if people want to learn more about you, where do they go and find your stuff on the internet?
I'm fairly evasive. I don't have a website or a blog of my own. So basically, Twitter at DB Halbert author. DB Halbert was taken for some reason, and on Amazon, searching DB Halbert will find my book, which gives you an email address to contact me if you have any more questions as well inside of it.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, those are the places to contact me. If anyone has specific questions for me or comments that they want to direct at me as well, my email is dbhalbertauthor@gmail.com. I don't know if that's going to mean that my inbox is going to be filled or not, but
you will find out. Yeah. Okay, cool. So thank you so much for watching out there. And you can, of course, also support and help this channel keep going by exchanging $1 for a Patreon reward. You can just check the description field for the link, and I'll also put David's links down there in the description field for you to check out. So all there's left to say is stay safe out there, and see you next Monday.